Hi, my name is Steve Gathercall, and this is a short video on how to paint these beautiful cygnets in watercolour. Okay, I'm using Archer's cold press paper, £140, the textured stuff, and also I've already prepared the drawing itself. I've sketched the drawing out, and I've also used one of these rule pens you can see here to apply masking fluid in very small, very fine lines where there are some highlighted feathers down in the bottom left, the top right and the top left, just to preserve the white of the paper, as the watercolour purists are known for not liking the use of white paint. So I thought, right, I'll try and do this traditionally and just use the white of the paper rather than any white paint. I'm using Winsor & Newton professional watercolour paints, and I will be using probably just 2 brushes throughout the duration, a 00 and a number 6. And as you can see now, I've just now started with my 00 brush on the eye area, and I'm using a bit of burnt sienna mixed with a touch of sepia, which I felt gave me just about the right colour I needed for the very first layer of the brownish area around the eye. It's the thing with watercolours that you need to build up layers of thin layers to get that lovely feeling of depth and translucency that you get from transparent paints. And so here I'm just applying the first layer, and it will take 2 or 3 layers, I reckon, before I've got the right depth. The thing with transparent paints is that the more layers you add, the darker and darker it gets, and it'll keep getting darker. But once you've gone too dark, that's it, you can't go backwards, not very well anyway. So here I'm continuing on with the dark area around the eye. I've put the first layer down, and the mix I'm using is just about, I would say, consistency of milk, a bit watery. And I should also be using Payne's Grey for the iris area of the eye and the pupil. I think I like about the Payne's Grey is that when it's watered down, it looks almost blue, but as you add layers, you can actually build up to a very nice, rich black. Gives you that nice blue-black look, which actually I'll be utilising later on when I do the beak. But here for now, I'm just carrying on adjusting the amount of burnt sienna in comparison with sepia. As I'm building up the layers, I can see the colours starting to take shape. But it's mainly burnt sienna. And the sepia just adds a nice bit of dark and tones the sepia down a bit because it's a little bit too brown. The thing with colours is I think it comes with experience, just knowing what colours you think would suit. And by building up thin layers, at least if you go wrong early on, you can correct, because you haven't gone too dark at this point. You've got a chance to correct. But once you've gone too many layers on, it's very, very difficult to correct. You can wet and lift off some paint to go back a bit lighter, but it isn't that easy to do. It's nice to get it done in the first place. Here you can see I've just put in a bit of Payne's Grey down for the iris and pupil area. There's not much distinction between the iris and the pupil because it's such a small eye, but as long as I can make sure that we get the dark of the pupil showing and a hint of light in the eye by not completely covering the area with black as I build up the layers. What I'll do here is I'll show you the layers as we're done now, building up the depth in the eye and the second eye as well that we can see in the other cygnet. And then the next clip will start with the eyes finished, rather than bore you all the way through building up the layers and extending the video time. Certainly these brushes I'm using, these Winsor & Newton brushes, tend to be just right for my kind of work. I've always emphasised detail. I can't help. I just love putting in the very fine details whenever I'm doing a painting, whether it be oils, watercolour, pastels, whatever. I do try to maintain lots of nice fine detail. And these Winsor & Newton brushes seem to have a nice stiffness to the actual hairs, so that I can maintain control even when the paint is quite thin, and they seem to maintain their shape quite well. I'm using just the tip of the brush, and it's a very light touch, and the paper I'm using, because it's the cold press, it very quickly soaks up the paint, so it can dry quite quickly actually, so you don't actually have to wait very long at all before you go in with the next layer. I have tried the hot press paper, and yes, it's great for fine detail, but I found that it doesn't soak up paint quite as quick, which does make blends and washes a bit more difficult. But anyway, I'm now moving on to the second eye. I think we're nearly done with the first eye. We'll go back and touch it up a bit, as you'll see in the next clips, the finished eye. But I'm basically repeating the process here in the eye of the second cygnet. There's a bit more of the pupil area visible here, and a little bit more light shining in the eye. So what I'll do, I'll leave a very small area of the paper still showing, and I may just wet it and lift off a bit more at the end, depending how much of a highlight there is. Something else I find you have to keep an eye on as well, no pun intended. As you build up the layers and the colours get darker, your perception of how dark you need it to go tends to change in the rest of the painting. So I tend to flip back and forth between the painting, and so I try to do some of the darkest areas first to give me an idea of how dark the darkest areas are going to be, which then gives me an indicator of how light I need to go in the lightest areas, and then try and fit the correct tones in between. Certainly it does tend to get a little bit confusing at times. I find that's the best way that works for me, is trying to put the dark areas in first. Starting to build up, as you can see, a much bigger dark area in this eye, and this is mainly Payne's grey. There's a touch of sepia in there, and there will be some more burnt sienna as well. We're certainly getting nearly there with this eye as well, actually. Just a gentle touch with the tip of the brush. As you can see, the burnt sienna is now showing up against Payne's grey. They both need to go a little bit dark at the moment, so I'll put another 2 or 3 layers in, I reckon. Certainly getting there now, feeling a bit happier. And we're nearly at the end of this session now, and we'll move on to the finished eyes. Right, here we are. Looks like the eyes are finished, but now I'm thinking about the fur. Well, I call it fur, it's feathers really. I'm starting off here with a number 6 brush because I'm not quite sure as to how thick I can get the lines, or how thin rather, with this particular brush. They might not be thin enough, but what I'm doing, I'm trying out the number 6 brush. This is burnt sienna again, watered down. This is quite thin, quite light. I'm starting to build up the feathers in the direction I can see on the reference. I'm not totally happy that I'm getting fine enough lines with this brush, so I may well switch over to the 00 again. The reason I keep getting mixed up with fur and feathers, I just find that feathers seem to be just like fur, and in effect that they're just lots of thin lines as I see it. So painting or drawing feathers seems very similar to me as to doing fur. You have to make sure everything's going in the right direction and following the same flow as you see in the reference as to which way the feathers are laying. You may see the occasional feather where you can actually see the form and shape of a feather, but most of the time, to me, it just looks like a series of thin lines closely clumped together that gives the shape of a feather. I'm still carrying on with this number 6 brush, but I decided now I think they might be a bit too thick, these lines. And the reason I want to try and keep the lines as thin as possible, as the strokes as thin as possible, is because we use what's called negative painting. So I've switched to the 00 brush. By negative painting, I mean because we go from light to dark. If we can't put light on top of dark, in other words, it's very, very difficult to get transparent lighter colour over the top of a darker colour. So what I'm trying to do is make sure I leave enough of the paper showing through, which will end up being the highlights in the finished product. So for each layer, I'm trying to make sure that I put down enough strokes to give the impression of a layer of feathers, also leaving enough white space to ensure that these show through at the very end as highlights. So each subsequent layer I put down, I try to make sure I don't go over the same area as I did before, same lines, but also make sure that I leave some of the white of the paper showing through. It's a difficult thing to do really, and can be quite time consuming. Whereas if you were doing something like an oil painting, you could just go over the top at the end with white paint for the highlights and then colour them, or add some white to another colour. If you try and add white to a watercolour, you then lose the transparency and it becomes a bit chalky. It doesn't look as nice as it should do. You lose some of that lovely transparency. So now we're gradually building up a bit more form, as you can see with this. Getting on better now with the 00 brush, and you can see some of the form of the feather starting to take shape. I'll just do the strokes closer and closer together in certain areas to give the effect of shading, because several strokes close together will look darker than several strokes that are not close together, if you see what I mean. So you can give the effect of a shaded area, which makes sure that we can keep the overall tones right in this first layer. And again, this is just the first layer, so it'll be time to correct later on. Just slowly adding some very fine lines again with the tip of the brush. And I think we'll move on to the next section. So continuing on, this is the continuation of the fur. We're still building up the first layer, but every now and then I will go back into an area where I had previously put some strokes down, but adding a few more in there just to concentrate the strokes, which gives you the effect of a dark area. So I'm still using burnt sienna with a bit of sepia in there to give it a sort of a dirty brown look, because at the end of the day these are cygnets and they've not quite got their pure white colour of swans yet. Some places they're dirty grey and some are dirty brown, but very rarely is actually any white in their feathers. This first layer you'll see me dot about all over the place now, as I tend to do, just adding in details. With this just the very tip again of the 00 brush, sometimes having to put down some very fine lines. But I tend to put down the areas that stand out the most, which to me normally are the darker areas, and then I'll put my concentration of paint strokes down in that area and then fill in around, particularly with the negative painting, because I don't want to put too much colour down in an area where at the end of the day I need quite a lot of the paper showing through. So I'll always go for the more shadowy areas first to put my paint strokes down, and that then also just starts to give me some of the form that I can see in the overall painting which I'm looking for. Certainly quite therapeutic in my mind anyway. Seems to be one of those things that very relaxing. But here we are, going back and forth over this first layer, adding in more, but you can see that it's starting to take more shape now as I go back. Adding a few more first strokes. Obviously, so I've said it again, haven't I? Feathers. Just making sure that I still leave some of that white paper showing through. Otherwise, it will tend to lose some of the look of depth, and with the highlights missing, it can sort of flatten the overall look of the final painting. This number 00 brush has really served me quite well. I'm quite pleased. Mostly been fairly new to watercolours. I'm still finding my way around with what paints to use, what paper to use, and what brushes. So far, the Winsor & Newton brushes and the Arches cold press paper seem to be more forgiving than the other combinations I've tried so far. The only trouble with this 00 brush is that it doesn't actually hold much paint, so you'll see my hand disappear quite often to load the brush again. You don't, because there's not many hairs there in the brush, there's no volume to hold the paint. These paint strokes are getting quite small now, as you can see. Well, I'm quite pleased the overall effect was starting to get now. Starting to look like we're getting a bit of shape, and it's starting to actually look like a couple of Cygnets. Well, moving on. Now we need to think about some of the feathers that are lower down, and I'll switch back to the number 6 brush here because we need to make sure that these forms or shapes here are a bit looser than we've had before, because we're not seeing such detailed area here. It's slightly out of focus. So again, with the burnt sienna, with a small amount of sepia in there, we're looking at just putting down some loose shapes to give us a bit of form in that particular area. I just dabbed with the tissue just then because although I've thinned the paint down, it was a little bit too watery, or in some cases I just simply put too much paint down, so I lifted it off with the tissue. Because this area in particular, not only is it not very well defined because it's slightly out of focus, it's not actually all that dark either, and I want to make sure that I don't initially go too dark. But all I'm doing is just putting some very loose strokes down with the tip of the brush, just to give the indication of feathers, and I shall continue like this all round the bottom of the beak as well. It's just difficult sometimes to try and get this smooth transition to what will actually be a lost edge as the edge of the neck moves out into the sunlight. There's actually no form to it at all. It disappears. So to get that lost effect, I've got to make sure in the first place I don't put too much colour down and too much form. And then what I'll end up doing at the end is I'll use a paintbrush with just plain water on and just keep washing over the very edges of the form that I want to lose, if you see what I mean. So it will actually wash it out to just a plain paper. And just moving down a bit further around to the beak areas. I'm leaving the beaks till last on these initial stages, A, because I'm trying to think about how to do them, and B, I'm just wondering what colours to use in my head and how to approach actually getting all the different shapes that there are in those beaks. And it is actually quite a prominent part of the overall painting, and certainly in the reference. And the thing you notice straight away is the beaks, or what they call bills. I'm not sure actually, probably bills. I've been thinking about the colours all the while I've been doing this, but we'll see. I'll think what I come up with. I'm probably thinking of Payne's grey, a bit of sepia, probably not much more than that actually. Anyway, moving on now to the feathers and the second cygnet. There's an area here that's actually quite a bit darker and very little form at all. So I'm starting to fill it in quite loosely, and that will develop into actually quite a dark area that's also in shadow. Shadow being cast from both bills actually, and the way the sunlight and the light is coming from the right hand side here, it actually puts this area I'm working on now in quite a bit of shadow. So I've got to make sure I start building up those shadow areas once I've got this initial layer in place, showing me where my various forms are, or various shapes are. It's certainly quite important I get this particular area right. This is just very loose painting with a very watered down, weak mix of the sienna and sepia. Just the outline here of the second bird, which shall start to show some more form now. Oops, put too much on again, so quickly lift it off with tissue. Just trying to work out here what shapes I need to put in. This number 6 brush seems to be just about right for what I'm trying to do here. I know it can be quite time consuming watching these real-time videos, but I myself have often looked at time-lapse and think, oh, I wish I could just slow down a bit so I could see what's happening here, and it is surprising how slow and meticulous some of the brush strokes are. I thought I'd try and do a shortened video of short excerpts of real time. Starting to get a feel for the shapes I need to put in here now. I keep switching brushes at times as well, see later on, because there are some areas where suddenly the fur gets quite fine. I'll just switch back to the 00 brush and just use the tip of the brush again. Continuing on, I've now decided I want to add in a little bit more of the form. So what I'm doing here, I'm using yellow ochre and just doing some very light wash, is the best way I can call it really, in the areas I can see this particular colour. I'll get this in right now with these very initial layers, because this will show through, and there's not actually much more detail to go on top of some of these areas. I'm now going to just start touching up with the yellow ochre very lightly. It's a very thin mix, and as you can see I'm only using the 00 brush, which again makes sure I don't put too much on there, and I'm very lightly colouring in the areas where I can see this particular colour showing through on the reference. And again, later on, as I put further layers on, I will go back over with this wash again. And the nice thing about doing the wash every now and then, oops, just put too much on, is that it does help to sort of smooth in some areas so that they look a bit smoother, blend a bit better, instead of having quite stark brush strokes that look a little bit too harsh, or just going over the top with a very light wash, you can quite nicely smooth out some of that harshness, so it looks a bit softer. There certainly is a general softer feel with this particular painting because they, at the end of the day, they're young swans, cygnets, and there's a certain softness about their overall look that I'm trying to capture. So I will continue to use very light washes here and there between layers to try and give the impression of that smoothness I'm after. But the more I look at the reference, it's quite surprising how often I can see this particular colour appearing. And I'll tend to do this with any other colours I see as well. Just add the washes in as I feel I need them throughout the layers. And again, by going in early with some of the initial layers, if I do make a mistake, I'll get it wrong. Because we've gone in really early, we can usually get around that problem by either lifting it off, or the fact that we'll be putting a darker colour over the top later on. It'll hide up the mistake anyway. I can see a bit more realism creeping in now. Now I'm starting to do the coloured wash here and there. I've always found that the more accurate you can get the colours and capture all the colours there are in the reference, the more the realism starts to creep in. It's surprising the difference it can make just having a few of the correct colours and tones in place. I think I'm beginning to enjoy this one actually. It's quite nice to paint on this paper, and also the colours are coming out pretty good. It's never going to be exactly the same as a reference. None of my paintings are. And then what's the point? If it was exactly the same as a reference, you might as well just blow up the reference and put a big photo on the wall. But I just like to think that whatever I paint is my interpretation of the reference. So yes, the colours will be slightly different perhaps, although I do try to get as close as I can. And also the look and feel will be slightly different depending on what medium I'm actually painting in. There we go, a bit more yellow underneath the it gives that starting to build up the shadow area underneath the eye now, which again is just helping to add to the form we're trying to put in place. Okay, now I'm starting to add in some of the darker areas that give us a bit more shadow and shape. I'm using the 00 brush, just a very tip, and I've darkened the mix up now. I'm using a Payne's Grey and Burnt Umber, and these are very small brush strokes. I'm trying not to go over any of the areas too much where I've left paper exposed, and only some of the previous strokes, paint strokes. So in other words, I'm trying to give the impression of another layer on top of the previous layer underneath. And if I've left enough paper exposed with the first layer of paint strokes, you'll still see some of that paper show through even after this layer, which again will give that effect of highlights. And that's the art of negative painting, to try and make sure that you still end up with what looks like highlights at the end, which is in effect exposed paper. That can be very difficult. These are very small first strokes, so I'll be concentrating in any areas where it tends to look a bit darker or there's shadow. And this is when we'll really start to build up a lot more shape and form now. It can be very tedious work on a very large painting. Continuing on, again it's just the same mix. I'm using the Payne's Grey and the Burnt Umber just to give me these darker areas. Very small strokes, very fine strokes. You can actually see some of the form starting to take shape now. Surprising difference it makes just adding a few darker areas. I zoomed in a little bit too far. I'm just slightly cut the top of his head off, or her head, but if you get the general picture. I'm trying to do feathers that I still think looks like fur most of the time. The key seems to be not only making sure that your paint strokes go in the same direction as those on the reference. If you look carefully, most of the time um, the, the paint strokes are clumped together into little groups, which then tends to give the impression of a feather, or certainly a shape that implies a feather. And these always tend to be slightly angled, like a V shape is the best way I can explain it. So that's what I'm tending to do, is putting down a series of fine strokes, but in like a V shape. And then in between those V shapes, if you then go in with a little bit darker colour, that gives you the shadow at the base of the V that makes it looks like you've got a bit of depth there. So that's what I'm trying to be mindful of as I'm putting the extra darker paint strokes in. I still think it looks like fur to me whenever I do feathers, it really does. Same principle. I can see actually as well this Payne's grey and burnt umber I'm using won't actually need to go much darker. Look at the final reference. And the easiest way to just slightly darken in the area I've found anyway is to just add a light wash over the top, and that will instantly give you a much darker look to that particular area. If I use a small paintbrush like this 00 I'm still using, you can control how much of that wash you put in a certain area. It's just a little bit awkward with a small brush because you have to keep loading the brush up because it literally doesn't hold much paint. Sorry about working slightly off the top of the picture here. I just chopped a bit too much off, but I wanted to try and get close enough so you could see the detail. I didn't realise I chopped the top off a little bit. At least with the cold press paper, I found that you can quite very quickly go back over an area you've already painted because it does tend to dry very quickly, which is really nice. Unlike oil painting, we'll have to wait for the next day before I even think of doing another layer. This is fast becoming one of my favourite mediums to work with, watercolour. Okay, again, here we are. We've moved on a bit now. I've put some general forming around the top with the darker colours. See the shape starting to take shape now. I'm going to work in this left-hand area now, down on the bottom here. It's quite a bit darker here. There's quite a lot of shadow in this area. So I'm going to go in with the number 6 brush and a weak Payne's grey mix. And this effect I'm doing at the moment, it's I'll call it a stippling action really, because you can see on the reference there's like a mottled effect of what to me looks like downy feathers. So what I'm just dabbing the brush in this area, and as I do this from layer on top of layer, it then starts to give you that effect that I'm looking for, as long as I leave enough of the white paper exposed. Exposed white paper does become tainted with some of the colour, but that still shows up as being lighter than the surrounding areas and will look like, hopefully anyway, the mottled downy effect that I'm looking for. So it is quite a bit darker in this area, so these layers I'm putting on at the moment are very, very light compared to what we'll finish up with. So this is just the first layer of my One of my favourite colours actually, Payne's Grey, because it's so flexible. As I said before, it will go from a nice blue colour right to black, depending on how many layers you put on or how thick you have the mix. Quite fiddly this bit, but perhaps begin to see what I mean here by just dabbing and not just splashing the paint everywhere. The exposed paper is starting to give us some sort of hint of texture there. Overall, you can see that a lot of the texture is appearing now over the whole painting, purely by leaving white paper exposed. Obviously, it's been a different approach if you were, say, doing an oil painting, because you could put all that white area in later on, right at the end if need be. There's no problem going light over dark. But this mottled effect, it seemed to be taking shape. I'm quite happy with it. I tend to use what I call a stippling action with the tip of the brush quite often to get different textures. It helps with very, very short fur and very, very, very short feathers as well. Just a slight dabbing motion with the brush, and it does tend to give that stippled effect, because the exposed paper that's left tends to look like little hairs or little bits of fur. It takes a little bit of practice to get the hang of it. But even some of the lighter paint, you can see I'm stippling now over the top of areas that are already stippled, but the first layer of stippling still shows through as a lighter colour as well, which is good. So you end up with the white of the paper plus the lighter areas of the previous layers also showing through, and that's what helps to build up, to give you the depth. But it is painstaking and can take quite a while. But I'm finding that watercolour, even trying to achieve the level of detail that I like, is one of the quicker mediums for me to use, in producing a final piece of art. I seem to be able to do things quicker with the watercolour, definitely. This is very therapeutic. This is done the little fine detail pieces. I'm quite pleased how it's turning out at the moment. It's looking quite good. Number 6 brush coming in handy again. I even use the number 00 brush for very, very small stippling as well. Okay, well, I've crashed ahead now and gone over the whole painting with a bit more form, as you can see, and down the side here I've continued on with the light colours down the right hand side, and also the darker areas on the second cygnet. You can start to see now where I put down some of the masking fluid for the finer hairs. But I've gone over this whole painting with washes and a little bit more colour to give me the depth. Right, back again. Now then, I'm now going to apply washes over the entire painting to darken up some of the areas that I know need a bit more shadow, and same with some of the other areas really. It's just to start to enhance the shadows. I'm using Payne's Grey here, a very light mix of Payne's Grey. As you can see, it's nearly blue, but this area is in quite a bit of shadow, and I'm just bringing that value just in line with what I can see on the reference. And the bottom left needs to be a lot lighter, but still in shadow. And the very bottom left, there are some highlighted, very bright, fine hairs, which is what I've used the masking fluid for. And they will become more apparent as I use the wash. I should have used that blue masking fluid you can get, so you can actually see where you put it down, but all the masking fluid I had was the white, and it's actually very difficult to see it. And to actually start putting colour around it, it's very difficult to see where the masking fluid is. So lesson learnt, make sure I buy the blue next time. This is my number 6 brush, and a light application of wash. And I tend to do this every now and then, as I said before, over the whole painting. And I will do in the other areas I need to blend a bit more as well. If I find there's a bit more too much texture in some areas, this is an ideal way to knock that texture back or soften it a bit. Even if you just put plain water on the brush, put a bit too much on there, look. Just go over the area with plain water and it will loosen the paint up that's already on there, and you can get a nice softer effect. And I will go back and forth doing that in various places as well, and that also helps to blend one colour into another as well. If you just go over between the two where the two meet with plain water, you can blend them. Right, I've been putting this off for a while. Let us start on the beaks. Oh, Bill's beaks? It must be Bill, I think. What I'll do is I'll record this first beak, Bill, sorry. The colours I can see in there are Payne's Grey, Sepia and Burnt Umber. And what I'll do, I'll apply those colours where I see them in very light, weak mix, just to really map out those areas that I can see those colours in. And that'll eventually give me basically my map, where I then start to concentrate on getting the textures in there. So this lightest colour that I'm going to put down will actually be the lightest colour that I can see in the textures on the bill, because some of these colours will still show through right at the end. So I want to make sure that I get those reasonably right if I can. And say it is really, I can't see any more than Payne's Grey, Sepia, Burnt Umber in there. And we'll see how it turns out. But as I said before, because I've gone in nice and early with these light colours, we can correct if we make a huge mistake. I'm using the number 6 brush again because it's not huge amounts of fine detail here, and I want to get plenty of paint on at one go. It's easier to blend if you're using a bigger brush as well. Well, I find it is anyway. There are tiny bits of masking fluid here and there on the bill, which when rubbed off will show up as little dots of highlight, as I can see in the reference. That'll be quite helpful. I may have to just knock those back a bit with a little bit of wash over the top as time goes on. This is here as Burnt Umber at the moment. I can see some brown umbery type colours in this area, particular area of the beak. It will at the end of this session it will look a bit patchy, because it's, as I said, it's just a map of those initial colours that I will then build on with the various layers, and the edges will get blended together as I go on as well. This will be a little bit time consuming because there's quite a few different shapes in the beak area. Beak, I keep calling it a beak, it must be a bill, I'm sure it is. Anyway, continuing back with my Burnt Umber, I try to do all one colour first and then wash the brush out and try the other colour. I know it seems common sense to do that, but sometimes I do get mixed up and just accidentally dip it in another colour before I wash it out for the first colour. So I just got myself into the habit of making sure I do all one colour first, and then come back in with the next colour, my third colour, my fourth colour, whatever. Quite pleased with how it's come along so far. As I'm adding more values now and more tones, I can see where even some of the initial work that I did needs to go darker, needs a bit more blending. That's why I constantly go back and forth adjusting the colours, but I'd rather do that than go too dark in the first place. It's surprising how much of variation there is, even in the one coloured area I'm working on at the moment. This is I'm putting initially put some burnt umber down in here. There's actually some quite a lot of different shades even within this area that I'll need to build up on later. Once I get the initial map down of these colours, I'll be a bit happier then, because I can see what I've got to work with. I won't real-time record the other bill as well, because it'll be the same process as this one. So I'll just concentrate on recording the process of this particular bill at the moment, and see what it comes out like. The Payne's grey now. Weak mixture Payne's grey, but starting to add the shapes in where I see that particular Payne's grey. This is very, very light, and this very, very light will show through at the end, because I'll build up the subsequent layers. Even if I just use the same mix again over the top of this layer, it will darken, because as I said before, the more transparent layers you add, the darker it gets, even if you're using the same consistency of paint. Obviously you can quicken that process by making a thicker mix up, but I tend to like to build my layers up slowly. That gives me more control over the shading and the textures I'm trying to achieve. So I will end up going back over this Payne's grey I'm putting down now with the same mix, but it will make it darker in the areas I put it down. And it makes it a bit easier to blend then, because there's not too much extreme between the two colours I'm trying to blend together. I'm referring to the reference quite a lot here. It's surprising how much is changing. Slowly getting there, slowly getting there. Patience is the key. I think that's why I find it so therapeutic, because I have to be patient to get the detail I want. But even here with this light layer, I am introducing a certain amount of texture by not fully painting over certain areas I know I will need to show through at the end has been a bit lighter. And it also helps give me a bit more confidence when I see a bit more texture in there, showing me what the final product's going to look like. This is what people refer to as the ugly stage, I think, and it can be quite off-putting, because you think, oh god, it doesn't look anything like what I want it to, but you have to try and get past that ugly stage, which is another reason why I tend to do my paintings in small sections, because I'll go right through to nearly the finished product in one section to quickly get past the ugly stage and convince myself it's going to look alright at the end. It's a habit I've had for a while now, actually. It's not how a lot of artists work, but each to their own. My work seems to come out okay, and I'm happy with it. Grass is starting to take a bit more shape here now. I think one of the things I really enjoy about any of the mediums I use is when you start to add the detail and the textures. I really enjoy that part, and trying to figure out how to introduce certain textures as well to give that lifelike look. And I think what I end up doing with the bill is that I will end up doing some lifting at the end to get the highlights in place. In other words, I'll just be using plain water on a brush, almost dry brush, and just painting over an area that I want to lift out paint, leaving it just a couple of seconds to soften the paint underneath and lift off the tissue. That'll give me a highlighted area, which I can do again over the same area to get it a little bit brighter, or just leave as is. That's part of the tidying up at the end. That's something else I tend to do, or have to tend to do, is because I work in sections. When it comes to the more or less the finished painting, I then have to go over everything, touching up final details, blending, little wash here and there just to bring all those separate areas together that I've been working on individually. Starting to get there now. I'm quite pleased so far. This particular, I was a bit concerned about the beak. I wasn't quite sure what colours to use initially. This area I'm working on at the moment, I may end up lifting a little bit as to give me a bit more form later on. We'll see. I am doing a little bit of blending here because I'm making sure that where the edges of different colours meet, I'm just moving the brush back and forth, either a damp brush or a brush with very little water on it, just going back and forth to bring those areas together just a little bit. Almost there with these initial shapes. Getting there. I'm actually here at the moment. I'm deliberately trying to leave some areas with not as much paint in place. Give me a bit more of that texture look I'm looking for. I think overall the Payne's grey, perhaps with a bit of sepia, and that's going to be the best choice for giving that blue-grey look that I can see in the bill. But the trick is going to be making sure I've got the highlights in the right place to give that shiny look that I'm trying to achieve, and is quite noticeable in the reference. Because it's in such good focus on the reference, it's quite noticeable, so I need to try and reproduce that with my painting. It was nearly there now with all the initial layers, what I call the ugly stage. The next clip will show the finished bill, but all I have done is repeat what you've seen here now for at least 3 or 4 layers, just adding more of the Payne's grey, adding more of the sepia and more of the burnt umber, and blending them together where required, and also not putting much in certain areas to make sure the colour underneath shows through. This is round about there now, just for the base layer. Quite nicely once you've disturbed the paint underneath. Right, so carrying on a bit more here, I've done a couple more layers on that base layer that we just did, and you can see now it's really starting to take shape. I reckon another couple of layers at least, which I'll show in the next clip. Well, here we are, just now a couple more layers added, and you can see the difference is made. And I've also removed the masking fluid to reveal little dots on the bill as well, which I've knocked those back slightly with a very weak mix here and there as well. So not much more to do. Just to finish off, I thought I'd do a quick time lapse here of all the final details that I always end up putting in at the end of my paintings. I'm going over the whole painting now, adding washes here and there, lifting paint here and there, and as I explained earlier, sometimes I'm even using a wet brush to soften some areas. I'm doing a bit of lifting out on the beak to get some of the highlights back, as when you see the tissue suddenly appear is when I'm doing a bit of lifting out. But I'm now rubbing off all the masking fluid, and then once I've done that, I'm then touching up around those masking fluid lines, because they can be a bit harsh and they need knocking back a bit with a bit of colour. And here I'm just touching up all the little tiny areas, little things I can see that need to be altered or touched up, or generally a little bit darker here. It's a general case of washes and blending and the final product. Thank you for watching. Hope this has been helpful.